Sorry, Juliana, this is technical support. You're on mute.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, perfect. Okay, let's get started. So, tēnā koutou katoa, my name is Juliana Carvalho. I am a fierce disability activist, storyteller, author, and also known as a troublemaker. Alongside Olivia Shivas, I will be your host today. Olivia is a Poutiaki journalist at Stuff, covering disability issues. In 2021, she presented and produced an award-winning podcast called What is Wrong with You?, which gives us authentic and entertaining insight into the lives of people with disabilities. She lives with muscular dystrophy and uses a wheelchair to get around. I want to acknowledge that our dear Hannah Hickey will not join us today for personal reasons. I want to give a very welcome to everyone that's taking time to be here today with us. Just a quick housekeeping. If you are audience, you should remain on mute and with your camera off. Please use the chat to submit questions and make comments. The purpose of this webinar is to learn and tap into the wisdom of the overseas disability advocates and allies that we can use to influence the New Zealand government to strengthen and accelerate accessibility policy in this country. We want to ensure that we have the best possible future accessibility law for New Zealand, for disabled people and others with access needs. We have 8 key topics that we want to discuss with our international guests and New Zealand participants today. Olivia and I, we will provide the New Zealand perspective and commentary. Thank you so much to our international colleagues for joining us today. We really appreciate your joining us, coming to our aid at odd hours across different time zones. We have a dream lineup of speakers with David Lepofsky, Canadian lawyer and disability advocate, Judy Human, internationally recognized American disability advocate, the star of PrEP Camp, the legend from US that started a revolution. We have David Capozzi, former executive director of the US Access Board, Michael Fox, director of Access Australia and chair of Rights and Inclusion Australia, Gerald Klein, human rights advisor for the Human Rights Council based in Geneva, and Catherine Norton. I don't know how to say her name. She didn't want me to teach me how to say her name, but she's the director of the European Disability Forum. I would like to invite our ally, Diane Rogers, General Manager, Policy Advisor of Blind and Low Vision New Zealand, to give us some background where the government is up to right now with the Access Alliance assessment. Diana, please.
Thanks very much, Juliana, and thank you to our international disability advocates for being here today, and also our New Zealand advocate. It's going to be a really powerful webinar today, so really pleased. Blind Low Vision NZ is proud to support the Access Matters campaign. This campaign is led by disabled people and people with access needs. I appreciate being able to share what we know of things at the moment with what's happening with the government. I just wanted to say it's pleasing to see the progress with the new Ministry for Disabled People. That's been long awaited. We understand that ministers have decided in principle that accessibility will be part of that new ministry. The government is also seeking feedback on how accessibility legislation could work in practice. Officials right now are seeing how they can build in a process for identifying, preventing, and removing accessibility barriers. Yesterday, we heard from the Minister for Disability Issues that she's going back to Cabinet this week to recommend on the detailed design of New Zealand's accessibility system. Next month, the Minister will be seeking final Cabinet approval before the legislation is drafted and introduced into the House of Representatives in July this year. In addition, we understand there'll be more meetings and subsequent workshops, as well as the opportunity to provide substantial feedback on the government bill through the public select committee process later in the year. The Accessibility for New Zealanders bill will be based on the government's accelerating accessibility policy. From what we've read about that policy, right now, we do not think the bill will be as effective as it might be in being implemented. So we've got some work to do, campaigners. The government policy only partially delivers on what we think is about 5 out of 13 principles that we believe is essential to be an effective accessibility law. In the policy, there's no mention, for instance, of accessibility standards, no mention of enforcement mechanisms, and no mention of a notification process to report barriers and discrimination offences. We believe these details are needed in a legislative framework to create a fully accessible New Zealand, where disabled people and other people with access needs have an equal opportunity to achieve their goals and aspirations. This has been long waited for, and we want to see this opportunity to create that future that we've all been working so hard for. And this goes back decades and decades of effort of disabled New Zealanders. Right now, we can only see a coordination model, and that's a model to coordinate government. We don't think at this point we need a law to tell the government what it should already know and be doing already. Since 2016, when we formed the Access Alliance, we've come a long way, thanks to you and thousands of New Zealanders. Our movement has grown to almost over 20,000 supporters. Our challenge now is to make the most of the tiny window before this bill is introduced into the House. We're working really hard right now to make sure that we get as much as we can to improve on the bill through the select committee stage. We would not have got this far without the support, your support, New Zealanders from all walks of life, New Zealand business, local government, a host of people, as well as our allies and friends from overseas. We're grateful for your time today, and particularly the dedication to helping us work through our tactics over the next 2.5 hours of this webinar today. Thank you very much. Wish everyone the best for this webinar.
So I think I am up next. Hi everyone, my name is Olivia Shivers and I am calling in from the staff office in Tamaki Makaurau or Auckland. So I just want to thank again all our guests for joining in from all different, I think we have 6 different time zones on this call. So we just really appreciate all your time and I'm so looking forward to learning from what you've got to share. So our first topic is getting government to listen and do what's best for disabled people and for all New Zealanders. So as it's been previously mentioned, the government has committed to introduce the Accessibility for New Zealanders Bill in July 2022. We have from now until July, so a few months, to campaign for stronger accessibility legislation. So first, I'd like to ask some of our international colleagues to share their experiences of advocating to improve on accessibility policies and laws. I've got a couple of questions to get us started. So who do we need to influence to get a strong and effective accessibility law? And how do we make sure the needs of disabled people and others with access needs are actually front and centre of the legislation and how it's implemented? So who do we need to influence, and how do we make sure disabled people are at front and centre? So should we just go through the panelists? Let's start with David Lewkowski.
Good afternoon from Toronto time. It's an honor to be speaking to you and to all those folks in New Zealand. I love and miss your country, and to my colleagues around the world, it's great to be able to connect with you.
Excuse me, David, could I just ask you to put your camera on, please?
Oh, sure. My
Thank you.
apologies. Did that work?
It worked for a moment. If you could just try again, perhaps toggle back.
Okay, I don't know why it's not working. Just
That's it. Thank you.
for the benefits of those visually impaired like me, I am sitting with a screen background of the bridge of the Starship Enterprise. Why? 2 reasons. I love Star Trek, but also this is about steering New Zealand into a bright future that may seem like science fiction, but we can make it real. Who do you need to influence over the next time? I'm going to suggest multiple targets. Number 1, you need to target key members of the government caucus who can make a difference, including the Prime Minister's office. In fact, most importantly, the Prime Minister's office. The second thing you need to target are senior public servants. They give advice. They don't make decisions, but it's important to try to find out from them what, if you can even find it out informally, what the holdback is and why there's such reluctance to put teeth into this legislation. The third of 4 targets that you need to aim at very quickly are some opinion makers in the media. You need a couple of newspaper columns that are going to support you, or some airtime on Radio New Zealand and so on. And finally, you need to target the opposition parties. You need them to be ready to say now that they will put forward amendments to make it stronger, and that if the government doesn't deliver the legislation you want, that if elected after the next election, they will. So back to you.
Let's hear from Judy next.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to speak. Who do you need to influence? The disability community. The disability community should be outraged that this is a discussion that is going on now, given that the CRPD was ratified, and I think New Zealand was one of the first countries to ratify it. So now we're, 12, 14 years since that happened. And it seems as though you're lacking essentials that would ensure that new construction, major renovations are done in accordance with what the disability community needs. So I agree with many of the things that David said, but for me, it really is astonishing that you are at where you are at. And therefore, I really think you need to, David was mentioning this, it's both influencing legislative bodies, but I think it's very much getting the media involved, as he was saying, to really, I think there need to be powerful stories about the absence of accessibility, of standards and enforcement, and what it means to disabled people and family members and temporarily disabled people on a day-to-day basis. I mean, personally, I think the gloves need to be taken off because I just think it's intolerable.
Thanks, Judy. And our other David Kapotzi. I think you're still on mute, David.
Thank you. Let me just give you a couple of examples of things that we did in the US around the development of the Americans with Disabilities Act. A couple of things. First, I think it's important that you educate people with disabilities about the principles that you're striving for. One of the ways that we did that was the development of what we call disability diaries. And people would keep a diary of examples of discrimination that they faced or barriers that they faced. And then those were all collected by a task force that was headed by Justin Dart, who traveled literally across the country, every state in the nation, I think twice, at least twice, and held hearings to get information from people with disabilities and their families, and collected all of that. And then in a very moving moment, at one of the hearings before Congress, Justin came with boxes of disability diaries and explained what some of the issues were that people were facing. So that's one strategy. Another is what we found to be very successful, I think, was stories. I think it's really important to have personal stories that are compelling, that are memorable, short, but captivating people so that it's easy to understand what the problem is and how it can be fixed. Stories are really important. And then lastly, one of the things that was done before the ADA and actually after the ADA was passed were surveys by a polling firm called Lou Harris. And they surveyed attitudes of the public about people with disabilities and accessibility, and that was very helpful in showing that there was broad public support for legislation, and then after the law was passed, to implement the legislation. So those are just some strategies that worked in the US.
If I could ask David a question, because the ADA was in 1990, but issues around access started decades earlier. So I'm just wondering if you could briefly, I know you're going to talk about some of this later, but I think a lot of the momentum in the United States started after the Second World War, when disabled veterans really took this issue on. And so do you want to speak at all about that?
Sure. I mean, it's a long history. So our history with disability accessibility didn't really begin with the ADA. It began, as Judy said, post-World War II, returning World War II veterans who had a disability. Many of them were spinal cord injured or amputees. The first curb ramp was because a veteran returned to Kalamazoo, Michigan, and people in the community put in a curb ramp so that he could get around in his wheelchair, and that was 1947. But the first law that we passed that dealt with accessibility was in 1968, and that was called the Architectural Barriers Act, and it only applied to federal buildings. And that's the way a lot of countries start, is by only applying accessibility requirements and non-discrimination requirements to federal properties, federal agencies. That's how we started, and that was 1968. And that's actually one of the reasons why the ADA doesn't cover the federal government. So Section 504, which Judy, I'm sure we'll talk about later, also covered the federal government in the 1970s. And so we had these provisions that were already in existence, and so we didn't cover those in the ADA. Another reason why airlines are not covered in the ADA, they're covered under another law called the Air Carrier Access Act. So there were some things that were already addressed that are not addressed in the Americans with Disabilities Act. So those are some things that you need to think about, because I know you've already got some successes behind you. And the question is do you incorporate those into the legislation and kind of double down? Or do you say that these have been addressed already and only address things that are not addressed? And that's a strategy that you have to think about. We chose not to address things that were already covered. And yeah, I don't know if it was the right decision or not, but it was the decision that we made.
Thank you, David and Judy. It's really interesting. I like the idea of doing a diary. I feel like many people on this Zoom call will have a very long list of things to add to that disability diary. And we've just had a request to maybe minimize comments in the chat because it does block people's images and things like that. So maybe if we can just keep them to the minimum at the moment. And I'm sure there'll be opportunities to add comments and questions later on. So we've got a few more minutes on this question. So Michael Fox, do you want to share something?
Sure, thank you, and good morning, everybody from Sydney. It's 7:30 here in the morning, but very nice to see you, Judy and David. Haven't met for quite a long time, so it's a nice opportunity. I want to say three things. I'll be as brief as I can, Olivia. Firstly, as Judy said, it is surprising, this discussion, because Don Mackay from New Zealand, a very good friend of mine, was the chair of the CRPD in New York, and we worked closely together in 2006 to ratify or to resolve the convention. I was the convener of Article 9, accessibility, and worked closely with Don, and that was in, I think, October 2006, and New Zealand ratified the CRPD the next year in 2007. So we all thought that New Zealand would continue to be a leader in this process. And in fact, you do have legislation. There's a Building Act in 2004. You do have a New Zealand standard, 4121. And there was a very interesting Building for Everyone's guide prepared in 2019. So there is awareness and there is a history in New Zealand. There were many people I dealt with from Sydney after CRPD. It was very active for a few years, but not a lot in recent years, I must say. In Australia, we've been involved in accessibility. I'm an architect and an access consultant. I was the chair of the Standards Australia Committee for about 10 years, developing our standards in the 80s and 90s. And we had a DDA that came out in 1992. And I suppose that's the first recommendation to New Zealand, that you consider implementing something like the DDA, which is the Disability Discrimination Act. And that set down a federal mandate that required accessibility, it required equal opportunities. And the key to the DDA is that discrimination on the grounds of disability is illegal. A very, very powerful statement. And that statement, again, discrimination on the grounds of disability is illegal, drove the whole access program in Australia from 1992. And then very luckily, Sydney was awarded the Olympic Games in the year 2000. And I was thankfully involved in that. And we used the Olympics in the year 2000 as a huge opportunity for the most accessible environment, games, facilities, everything we could think of. And we developed what we called the process of access, which connected virtual access with physical access, and included transport, public domains, IT, communication, everything you could think of. So all that was very successful. Since 2000, we have had continuing, very active, coordinating organisations in Australia, which have linked government agencies, people with disabilities, and the community. And these groups, one of which I'm involved in, my organisation is Rights and Inclusion Australia. There's about 100 different organisations around Australia that have formed coalitions, We actively work with government at every level, and we are having ongoing reviews. In fact, right now, we're reviewing the housing legislation. So we've got a very active role, and I think perhaps the secret to that is the two things were the Olympics gave Australia a terrific catalyst for advancing accessibility. And since that time, the last 20 years now, 22 years, it's amazing, we have continued this action between the community and government. And I think that's the strongest message for New Zealand. You just have to find ways to work with every level of government. You've got to, and this meeting today, I don't know how many people there are, maybe 100 people involved in this. You've got to really consolidate that coalition so that you have strong, clear guidelines to progress this important agenda. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Jared Clyde, you've got any comments on this?
Certainly, thank you. And just a small correction on my title. I work at the Human Rights Council on behalf of the International Disability Alliance, just to avoid any confusion. I also used to work for the New Zealand government in the Foreign Ministry for 15 years or so. So from that perspective, rather than the who, which I think has been quite well identified already, I'd like to briefly focus on the how. As some of you, probably all of you know, New Zealand has its CRPD review in August this year. That's scheduled, at least, assuming it goes forward. And I mean, it's very unsatisfying and problematic that consultation is being left until after the legislation has been drafted. But at the same time, I think that is an opportunity in advance of that session for you to put all the pressure you can on and say quite clearly that the CRPD committee will be holding New Zealand to the highest possible standards of its jurisprudence, because New Zealand has put itself out there as a leader for many years on the rights of persons with disabilities. And in Geneva, in this upcoming Human Rights Council session in March, New Zealand is leading on a resolution on the rights of persons with disabilities. That might strike some of you as being an unfortunate irony, but you can use it as leverage. And the framing for the Foreign Minister really is that it will affect New Zealand's international reputation, as well it should. So I think you can also talk to members of the committee. Of course, one of them is Robert Martin, a New Zealander, and the chair of the committee is an Australian, Rosemary Kays. So there are some, I think you may have some good allies there. Of course, in August, it will be, I gather, too little too late if the law is being adopted in July. But I think that if you broaden your focus, of course, primarily focused domestically, but also a little bit internationally, you can contact the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Gerard Quinn, an amazing Irishman. I think he can potentially talk to people as well. So yeah, I think there's some options there, and really do insist that New Zealand walk the walk, as well as having a long period of having talked the talk. Thanks.
Thanks, Jared. And I'll ask Catherine if you've got any comments, and then hand it back over to Juliana.
Thanks very much, Olivia. And it's really nice to see you all, and I'm really happy to be part of your event. Indeed, when we were working on pieces of European legislation for accessibility in recent years, we also drew on the experience of our colleagues here in the room from Canada and from the US, because that has been a constant inspiration to the work we did in Europe. So I'm really happy to listen to everyone again this evening. I'm going to mention about 3 things that haven't been mentioned, because indeed you know who you need to target. And in our case, for politicians, it was always through public opinion. So with media, in some cases, the person responsible for writing a report in the Parliament and the text wouldn't even meet with us, and only did after we did a protest outside of the Parliament. So this is also something you have a lot when it comes to politicians and their opinion of the public. You have a lot up your sleeve. Also, we found alliances with other movements. Certainly older people were a great ally, the older people's movement, because they represent also a significant voter base. So for many politicians, these alliances we drew on a lot. For the technical work with civil servants, we used a lot of workshops and roundtables and trainings, and given them content and information, also legal advice, We had pro bono lawyers who helped us with, problems with European internal market. But I think a lot of these things are harder with COVID-19 restrictions. So I think the relationship building that we miss a lot because of not having the same contact and the same ability to get out on the streets, it makes it a bit more challenging for you. There's two last things. So I think was very useful for us to know. We had a lot of enemies. I don't know if you have enemies. You've only talked about your target politicians, but we had people campaigning very actively against legislation. And they were misinforming. They were talking about costs. They were talking about it not being necessary. We had one business association saying that accessibility legislation would make household appliances dangerous. So we had to understand our enemies as well and make sure that we brought them to meetings and made them speak in public, to air their views publicly so we could contradict them publicly. So this was very important for us because we had really enemies, and some of our enemies, adversaries, we could work with them on certain topics where we agreed, like in industry. There were some that we could or we could find industry partners who were committed to accessibility and would work with us anyway. And the last thing is that I think maybe Jared was referring to using the human rights instruments. I think this is very useful. It's also maybe between civil servants in government. It may be that the New Zealand officials need to speak a little bit more with their counterparts in the US or Canada or Australia about what they've put in place and how they do it, so they can know in those meetings as well that afterwards they will look bad if they don't do as well as they should do, given the reputation they've tried to build.
Thank you so much. Oh, you want something, Dave?
Could I jump in? Yeah, Catherine mentioned a couple of things that I just wanted to emphasize. So in the U.S. before the ADA, we had a long history of civil disobedience. There was a group called DAPT that would protest about non-accessible buses. We wanted lifts on buses. Now it's all low-floor buses. But that made a huge impact. She also talked about our enemies. One of the strongest opponents of accessibility in terms of transportation was Greyhound. And I can remember this one time we knew that they were going to come to a hearing in the Senate and testify about how expensive it would be to put a lift on a Greyhound bus. And we had a letter prepared before the hearing, because we knew this was going to come up, from a manufacturer who could put a lift on a bus for $12,000. And so Senator Harkin asked, so if you put a lift on a bus for, like, say, $12,000, would that be okay? And they said yes. And he goes, good, I have a letter here. So things like that, strategies like that, where you know what your opposition is going to say and then try to rebut those, it's really compelling.
Thank you so much, David. That reminds me of a story. When I moved to New Zealand back in 2012, I was working for the Health and Disability Commission. And at the bottom of the building, there was a brand new agency of the biggest bank of New Zealand. And it wasn't accessible. That was 2012. They built a brand new agency at the heart of Auckland that wasn't accessible. I called the media. They wrote an article. The bank said, oh, we couldn't find solutions, and da-da-da. The next week, there was a following up article from the same newspaper saying that kids solved the problem that the biggest bank of New Zealand could not solve. 10-year-old kids find the solution with the lift. We need to use the media. That's absolutely getting the public opinion. I make a few notes here, and really interesting. I think there's a to-do list for us here to focus on the key government agencies, including the Prime Minister, the opinion makers. That's another idea that we'll be discussing within the Access Matters campaigners to do to get people from all the media outlets and do a conference and see how, because language matters, communication matters, and the awareness as well for the wider audience. If we stay just in our circle of people with disabilities and our allies, we will never reach to the wider audience. And we need to get the empathy, the understanding, and people need to really be outraged, with this is so unacceptable. This is
David.
Judy.
David Lepofsky, can I just add a quick point?
Of course.
All of my colleagues have raised phenomenal points, and it really is humbling to be on a panel with all of you. One of the things I think that's distinctive to the New Zealand form of government, which is similar to the same as what we have here, is it's not like there's a separate Congress that's providing oversight. The decisions are being made somewhere within the government structure, and it's important to find out who's really calling the shots and what their real worry is. And because New Zealand is a small enough country, and you folks know enough people, it's really important to use word of mouth to find out whether some political staffers or some reporters have gotten the inside word on it, and find out what's holding them back. If they're saying we're worried because of some business group, the Labor government doesn't want to stick its neck out politically, then you need to get a business group to answer that and quell that concern. If they're saying it's a concern over budget, like, you've got to find out, apropos the point is find out who your enemies are. You got to find out what the arguments are being made against you. And unfortunately, because you've got a majority government, that could be buried within the public service telling the politicians to go weak, or it could be coming from the Prime Minister's office, or it could be coming from the minister. And you don't really know, or somebody that's holding the minister back. And so you need that information. Because it's a small enough country, you folks should be on the phones or otherwise trying to find out what the story is, because that will help you answer your own question of who to target with, what to target them with. Back to you.
Thank you so much, David, for your comment. So from the question time that we have between Jen Logie asking questions to the Minister Carmel Sepuloni, when there was the announcement of the new ministry and the introduction of the disability bill, the excuse is it's too difficult, it will be too complex. And we want to be complex because we need real change. We need like a real revolution. We need like a new legislation that will affect all the other legislations that we have in place right now that perpetuates disabling experiences for people with disabilities. And there's plenty of legislations. We need to end with systemic discrimination. Other points that were mentioned was, Judy said about that we're missing the essentials. Oh my gosh, we couldn't agree more with that. Having the accessibility legislation is the bare minimum to get started. Government needs to understand that the same way in Australia, discrimination on disability grounds is illegal. Lack of accessibility in itself is discrimination. Because if you have a job offer, right, open to everyone, but the place is not accessible, you're automatically discriminating all the people that need access to have access to that, to the job opportunity. Anyway, questions from the public before we have a quick break. So if you want to make any questions to the panelists, feel free to put on the chat. And I have our Super Mila in the background collating the questions. So you can put the question and also say to which of the speakers you want to have that addressed by.
Liana, while they're going through the list, I would also like to suggest that you've got many countries now that have good access laws. And it would be valuable to ask various countries the benefit of these access laws. And I think also to potentially engage with business communities and others to find out what they believe is valuable about these access laws. Because it's so commonplace in countries like the US. There are exceptions people are fighting. Things don't always get done the right way, absolutely. But, one of the organizations that David was talking about, Capozzi, earlier was ADAPT, and the group that they were fighting against was the American Association of Public Transportation, who vehemently opposed public transit. But in 2010, presented at an international conference that was hosted by the U.S. Department of Transportation about the value of accessible transportation. And so people like that who can be brought in, who can talk about why they were opposed and what made them change and why they believe this is important now. And I also want to underscore again what David Capozzi said about the issue of stories. And I think the stories need to come much broader than the 133 people that are on this call today. I know many of them belong to organizations, but they need to be simple stories. I couldn't go to my local public school because I was denied a job because, whatever, they're very simple stories. We need to make it more complex because I think, you're all having a proposed law that you want to put forward is really important. What do you want? I think you need to come together with what do you want, and then get legislators to come out opposing what you want. You can be working with them on the drafting. But I think you all need to be putting yourselves much more directly in the driver's seat.
Absolutely. When people say there's a lot of, opposition from all the cost, focus on economic growth that we're going to come out of this, that if we have accessibility legislation and standards, that will create a new industry, like a new sector. It will be good for economy. Okay, we have a question here from Elise, wondering how we can best leverage these wonderful international supporters to help us advocate to New Zealand government and media. Would you like to speak to that?
I think everybody on this call can give you examples of what they were doing. Catherine's raised her hand, how they work with media, and maybe even some of the columnists who have written pieces on the importance of accessibility, as well as who were engaged in trying to address getting accessibility put into the laws in our countries. I also think, looking at more work which is going on in a number of countries about diversity and inclusion, and how if DEI is something that government is pursuing, ending discrimination across the board, you can't begin to seriously have that discussion if there isn't a way of ensuring that accessibility is something which is seen as valued and implemented.
Thank you, Judy. Michael,
Sorry, can I just say something quickly?
Yes, I've just had one comment. Judy's made great comments about, we all know the problem of the enemies, and I really like Catherine's comments about enemies. We've had the same thing in Australia at various times. I think we've all had that situation. But the way we've really handled that typically is by balancing costs against benefits. And we do regulatory impact statements and studies and so on. So every new piece of legislation has got a fairly balanced costs and benefits. And of course, the benefits to the total community is overwhelmingly in favor of accessibility legislation. So I think it's really important to always balance the costs and the benefits. Thank you.
Very much, Michael. Elise, you would like to make a comment?
Yeah, sorry. I was thinking in terms of international, like I said, I'm really grateful for all the international speakers on this call. Thank you so much. I'm thinking for media, Bella Hadid just came out about the discrimination to the students in New Zealand, and that made newspapers, not just in New Zealand, but newspapers around the world. Do we have any international disability people that can kind of go, hey, New Zealand, you're not walking the walk. You're talking the talk, but you're not walking the walk, to actually make that international splash? I agree with others. I think the gloves need to come off now. We do not have time to put the subtle pressure on, it needs to be overt. So is there an international spokesperson figure that people on this call can suggest that we reach out to actually kind of point the finger and say, actually, this isn't quite good enough? And then in terms of politicians, like I know the mayor's office in New York, for example, maybe having a reach out to the equivalent here in New Zealand saying, hey, this doesn't seem strong enough. This is what we're doing in New York. You're just enacting this. Again, is there those key people that we could reach out to put pressure on the New Zealand equivalents?
Well, I make a comment straight away. I think you've got the panel right here.
Exactly.
I think today you've got half a dozen of the leading people around the world, if I may include myself, but certainly with Catherine and David and Judy. If this exact group could have a Zoom with the Prime Minister or the relevant minister, we could ask them to throw their hardest question at us, and I'm sure that our panel could answer that, and I think that could happen tomorrow. I think you don't need to go further than this panel. You've assembled a terrific panel today. We're covering the UN, we're covering human rights, we're covering Europe. We've got a global consensus here, and I think we would, as a panel, I'd certainly be pleased to be involved in a session with government to press this case and answer and ask them. I think we should ask them, give us your hardest questions, see how we go. I think we'd all be pleased to do that.
Thanks.
It's David Lepofsky. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, no, this panel is part of our strategy to get international attention, because we've been doing everything domestically that we possibly can. We presented stories, we did protests, we made a lot of the suggestions. We already done it without, having the success. So this panel is part of this strategy to tap into our international community to put pressure on New Zealand government.
It's David Lepofsky. Can I jump in?
Of course.
I absolutely love Michael's idea. I mean, I think what you want to do is write an open letter to the Prime Minister saying that you've amassed a bunch of folks who are prepared to donate their time and would be happy to answer the Prime Minister's questions, and they can have Cipollone on the call, and it doesn't have to be public, whatever, but let's have it. And you could, the common message will be what they're proposing is not going to do the trick, but there are ways to do it right and to do it cost effective and to do it in a successful way. Let me just go back to the question you asked earlier and offer you just a couple of quick thoughts with respect to how do you get the media. My thoughts in rapid succession are these. Number one, the media do not cover issues. The media cover events. So you need to structure an event around which, whether it's an individual facing an individual barrier or whatever, but that becomes, you catapult that into your message. If your recurring things are, here's a barrier and their bill won't fix it. Here's another barrier and their bill won't fix it. Here's a barrier that would be easy to fix and their bill won't fix it. Here are barriers they're about to create that could be prevented and their bill won't fix it. That kind of strategy works. A core thing that I would encourage, just two other quick thoughts. One is that we are used to thinking of media as organizations that cover things. We bring the facts, they decide whether to cover them. It's actually a persuasion exercise, and it's a dance. It's kind of a dance of a back and forth, and you need to find report. If you try to go in at the assignment editor level, your chances of getting in are minimal, but are less, I should say. If you try to go in at the editor level, asking for a meeting with editorial boards and so on. In fact, we could probably help you with that too if you wanted to offer a round robin of us talking to, for example, a couple of editorial boards. That too could help. But the last thing is, there is a core message I think that you might want to hook onto to give this some new edge, and that is coming out of COVID. Coming out of COVID is going to mean two things. Number one, all the talk about building back smarter where things are looking here in Canada, we're looking at building back inaccessible. And we're using or marshaling arguments under our legislation to say that's a bad thing. But to warn them that this makes it not just a, hey, we have barriers. Hey, we're about to create new barriers as a part of coming out of COVID. And that's got an edge that would make people sit forward and listen. And related to that, if you can link it to tourism, as COVID comes to an end, New Zealand is going to want to open its borders again to tourists. But New Zealand is not a particularly good destination for tourists with disabilities, and there's upwards of 1 billion around them. So the question you use on the Prime Minister is, do you want New Zealand to have the access to a market of upwards of 1 billion tourists with disabilities? Don't you think that would be more helpful to New Zealand's recovery from COVID? So if you, and that may get some editorial writers going in a way that they've not thought about it before. Back to you.
Thank you so much, David. We need to do a quick break, 10 minutes break. I just want to say, like, personal story. I'm having to have shower in the backyard because there's no accessible housing. So, and that's just like someone that is well educated and should have, like, it's not that I don't have the means. It's just that there's no option at the moment. And there are thousands of people that are in similar situation. We're going to have a very quick break, 10-minute break. If you can move your body, let's get our brain wake up, and we get back in 10 minutes.
So we're going to combine the next two topics because there's a lot of crossovers. So topic 2 is pushing for stronger policy. And we're also going to go to the next topic, which is lessons on accelerating accessibility from your region and country. So we'll hear from our international panelists on this. So we know that we've been given weak policy based on your experience. And how can we campaign the government to make policy stronger now before the bill is drafted then and then over time? And from your region or your country, what has worked well to accelerate accessibility? Does one of the panelists want to volunteer and start first?
I'll
start. This is David.
Can I have a go at that? Is that all right, Olivia? Okay.
Go ahead, Michael. Okay.
I'm sorry. I think the thing that's worked best for us is, I think has been said by many of the panels, explaining the reason and the benefits of what we're doing. And to really make that explanation work, we've developed what we call a process of access, which means that access is a process from communications to information to IT to public domains to transport to buildings to services to equipment. It's a whole process. And we've done many programs where we've explained that process of access so that we say that you take what we call a holistic approach, that you're not just talking about we're not talking about an accessible toilet, for example. We're talking about an entire process. And many of our workshops and sessions have been with people with a range of disabilities, more or less as Judy said, just saying, Judy, please tell us what your day's like. And it's an incredible question in a workshop because you'll get someone who'll say, well, it takes me 3 hours to get up and get ready to go anywhere. It takes me an hour and a half to get a taxi to turn up, etc. And you really people start, and perhaps at government level, really realize the complexity of accessibility and how important that holistic approach is, that if the information doesn't work, and you can't even call the taxi, you can't get it to the transport. If the transport doesn't work, you can't get to a job. So I'd really emphasize the importance of having a holistic approach and talking about that process of access. I think it makes it very understandable, particularly when it's demonstrated by people with a range of disabilities about that process, their personal process of getting through the day. Thank you.
It's David Lipovsky. Want me to jump in?
Yeah, go ahead, David.
Okay. Well, I can't list like all the ingredients, but let me give you a couple of high points to think about. The first thing that we have learned is that legislation has to provide specifics on what the government implementers need to do and timelines when they got to do it by. Because a law like our National Accessible Canada Act that just says the government can do things but doesn't say they must do things and when they've got to do it by to implement it doesn't accomplish much other than getting people frustrated and creating delay. And in fact, in national hearings on our Accessible Canada Act in 2018, 2019, that was something that resonated with the disability community, the opposition, the media, the public. The idea of public servants who can do it whenever they feel like it, if they ever feel like it, very quickly boils down to kind of a farce. The second thing is one-stop shopping enforcement. Now, I know in the States they don't do it this way because it's a huge government with different agencies having responsibility in different areas. But we have found, at least within Canada, and I think the smaller you get, and if you looked at Israel, you'd see the same thing. And New Zealand is certainly smaller than Israel and smaller than Canada in terms of population and size. You need one expert enforcement agency. When I read the paper that you sent out for this that said that the government's looking at simply adding some sort of accessibility mandate to different agencies or enforcement bodies that have other regulatory rules, that's a formula for failure on two fronts. And I'm going to present it to you really quickly now in a way that you could present it to government, the media, the disability community, and I'm hoping it'll resonate. And we've learned about this. First, it tells people with disabilities, you are going to have to throw spaghetti at the wall to figure out where you go to file a complaint and expect to be kicked from one government department to the next. And that's like, everybody gets it that that's really bad. The second thing is you want to get away from enforcement bodies that already have ongoing relationships with particular sectors of the economy because they're going to be leaning in their favor. And the third thing is you don't want to have to educate multiples of enforcement bodies in a small country like New Zealand on what accessibility requires and how to enforce it. In any country, but particularly in a smaller country, it makes a whole lot more sense to have one crack team that's responsible for that and that can handle that across the board. The final point, and there are millions more, but I don't want to monopolize time and I want to leave time for my colleagues to give their perspectives. But one of the messages that we've learned is to emphasize that a core principle should be that the government should never use public money or allow anybody else to use public money to create or perpetuate barriers. Now, when you say it that way, people out there will immediately nod their head and go, well, of course not. But then you turn around and you can say, but their legislation or their plan doesn't require that. It won't effectively enforce that proposition. So those are just a few ingredients I'll offer you kind of upfront. Back to you.
This is David Capozzi. If I could go next. I just wanted to talk about kind of how we developed the Americans with Disabilities Act is very much like what you're doing. So we started with principles to help us in the for the occasion when we knew that there was going to be a tough decision to make. So we started with principles like make requirements measurable, assign time frames for progress. Deadlines could be prolonged, but access shouldn't be diminished. Require public involvement in the development of regulations and standards. Have strong enforcement requirements. Require new things like new buildings and new vehicles to be accessible. Those were some of the principles that we started with. But I'll tell you some of the things that we didn't do well, and I wish we did, and maybe you could learn from that. One is when I said have timeframes and measure them. We don't do that very well in the US. We don't have a good reporting system. And those that we do don't always work. And I'll give you 2 examples. Section 508, we haven't talked about yet, but it addresses IT accessibility or ICT accessibility. Section 508 applies to federal agencies when they develop, maintain, use, or procure technology. And standards were required to be developed by the Access Board. There's technical assistance required. The standards have to be updated every so often. There's an enforcement mechanism, but there was a reporting requirement that the Department of Justice do a report every other year on how the federal government is doing on implementing. Well, that was 1998. It was passed. So every other year, I don't know, it's what, 11 or 12 reports? They've done 3. So if you don't have the information, you don't really know how well things are going. Second example, we had time frames for progress. We gave Amtrak, which is the inner city rail system in the United States, it's like via Canada or things, rail systems like that. We gave them 20 years, or 2010, to make all of their stations accessible. By 2021, 19% of their stations were accessible. So even though we gave them 20 years, did they do anything? No, they made 19% of their stations accessible. And here we are, almost 30 some years later, and we're having to fight an uphill battle because the data wasn't available, and people weren't holding organizations accountable. So it's important, I think, to have time frames, but it's really important to have data that you can use to hold people accountable and then actually do that. Those were things that we didn't do well enough. And then I know Judy wants me to talk about the Access Board. So one of the things that I think worked well in the US is there's an independent federal agency called the Access Board that I used to be executive director of, that consists of 25 members. There's 13 people from the general public who are appointed by the President of the United States to serve on the board. And then there's 12 federal members, very senior members, kind of like a ministry level. And they are responsible for developing accessibility standards for everything you can think of. Buildings and facilities, transportation vehicles, stations, IT accessibility, medical diagnostic equipment, everything you can think of.
Children's playgrounds.
Playgrounds, the great outdoors, swimming pools, yada, yada, yada. And they have a requirement to provide technical assistance on all of those guidelines and standards that they develop. And it's been I think it's been a good model of good government. And as a result, at least 2 countries that I know of have replicated the system. Poland created a Polish Access Board, they call it the Accessibility Council. And Chile recently created the Chilean Access Board, which they call the Universal Accessibility Council for People with Disabilities. And I can give you more information offline about how the Access Board worked and how these other agencies were created. But I think it's a model you might want to look at.
Can I go next?
Go, Judy, and then I think Jared has his hand up as well.
Sorry. So if I could carry forward with what David was saying, I completely agree that timelines are very important. I do, however, believe that laws are very important, because if you've got strong laws in place and the timelines are not being upheld. At least in the United States, there are ways of litigating against what they're not doing. So if there is no law, and then there's nothing to hold people accountable to. So I think we see in a country this large, of which obviously New Zealand is nothing compared to the size of the US, which is why I think it would be much easier. What we do see is that states then will sometimes pass laws that are stronger than the federal law, and that implementation will be done within states and local communities. So a question that I have for all of you, at some point I would appreciate if it could be answered. Are there any parts of New Zealand where they have a good standard, where they are constructing accessibly, where they are doing what you want, that could be utilized as a model for what should be occurring across the country? If there's anything like that, I think that could be really, really very important. And I think another point may be to look at in Europe and here and maybe Australia with some of the provinces and Canada, again, to look at this model of communities that are doing a good job on implementing. Because I think, you know, the smaller I mean, you have a reasonably large geographical area, but the smaller the space that you're looking at, the more readily it's possible to be addressing issues of access and compliance. I really want to emphasize another point that David Capozzi made, and that is around technical assistance. I think technical assistance is something that we do reasonably well in the United States. It's linked to many, many of our pieces of legislation. And I think it's really important because effective technical assistance, you know, like we have regional ADA organizations. We have a national job accommodations network. We have the Access Board, which if you go and look at the Access Board in the US, and I'm sure in Australia and other places, you can see the kinds of information that are put up there. And I think that's really important to be able to demonstrate the work that the laws are resulting in, the TA that is being given formally as TAO reports, which are being written, which provide, you know, specific information about how to deal with issues.
Thanks, Judy. It's interesting you ask if there are any particular regions or areas that do accessibility really well in New Zealand. And I don't think nothing really pops to mind because I think our general accessibility, you know, the laws we have are national rather than kind of regional. And I was talking to one of my colleagues and they were asking me, oh, can you think of any like really good accessible restaurants or eateries? And I couldn't really think of one that was like 100% fully accessible. Either maybe they did have an accessible bathroom, but they didn't have mobility car parks, or they may have mobility car parks, but then some of the tables were going to be too high for someone in a wheelchair. So it was, yeah, it was a tricky one.
I mean, you know, you're not that far from Australia. It's a joke, but I kind of think you need to take the entire disability population and send them for a month to Australia and look at what they have to see what they don't have, or ship some of them over here or to wherever to see what it is we're talking about. Because to me, I think one of the issues is people don't have a vision of what this should look like. And if they had a vision of what this should look like and what other people have, I think that would put fire underneath some of the bellies. And I'm sorry, I am beyond speechless for this entire conversation. It just, I mean, when I first heard about New Zealand decades ago, people talk about it as a model for healthcare and many other things. So it's just kind of a natural assumption on my part that things like schools, hospitals, public buildings, etc., of course they'd be accessible, you know, but so I think there needs to be, I can't say it enough, a way of giving models, not just, I think it's got to go beyond people's stories, because I really feel like people in New Zealand don't know what it should look like. You know, what is what you want? What experience should people be able to expect? Not that they have to beg for it. They should be able to expect it.
It's really true. Thanks, Judy. Jared, sorry, you've had your hand up for a while. Do you want to go next?
We can't hear you.
I can't hear you, sorry,
Yeah,
Jared.
we can hear Jared.
But your mute sign is not on.
Yeah.
So.
Is your microphone? No, we cannot hear you.
Okay, what about now?
Oh, yeah, now, yeah.
So I think in New Zealand, my recollection is that there's not such a strong culture of strategic litigation, nor so much a strong human rights culture in a way, and that partly relates to education and partly to our legal system. And I think, I mean, there's not time to develop that in the next few months, of course, but in the longer term, I think that, for example, using the option protocol to the CRPD, we acceded to that just prior to Robert Martin's election, and perhaps many New Zealanders are filing complaints. If so, great. I know they take a long time to resolve, but exploring New Zealand domestic litigation as well, I think it is well worth doing, just as a matter of strategy, and it's something you could indeed advocate for in the context of the legislation. Along the other list of things is for accountability measures. My sense is that the Health and Disability Commissioner, is kind of quasi-judicial or sub-judicial and is not adequate. I forgot to mention earlier in terms of those individuals to speak to. Our Human Rights Commissioner, Paul Hunt, is fantastic. I don't know what he's like on the rights of persons with disabilities, but there's, of course, also the Disability Rights Commissioner, Paula Tesoriero. So there are people, presumably, that we can use and may have ideas for improving bad policy. And I think back to my time as a bureaucrat, I'm not familiar with the legislation, so I should say that, but if it's possible to come up with a fairly short, simple list of priorities, a brief explanation, the key flaws in the legislation, the key gaps are X, Y, Z, they can be resolved by doing ABC, and here, even drafting amendments, right? Draft amendments that you can send to politicians for proposals. So it becomes quite technical in a way, but I guess that's the work in front of you all in the next few months. So it can't be just a general, this law is inadequate. You need to get right into it, I think. And I'm sure there'll be plenty of help from around this virtual table if you need it. But I do think that prioritization and keeping it quite I don't want to say realistic or pragmatic, but it needs to be rights-based, but it does need to seem sellable to the wider public.
Thanks, Jared. We have Michael with his hand up, and then Catherine next.
Thank you, Olivia. Look, just a couple of comments picking up on this session, which was going to be talking about enforcement and timelines. David in Canada talked at the start about the enforcement process, and a model that you might find useful in Australia is we have the DDA, which requires discrimination on the grounds of disability is illegal. To make that operational in Australia, the DDA set up the Australian Human Rights Commission, which has got offices all around Australia, and anybody in Australia can make a complaint or a comment about any form of discrimination. It is unlimited, and that Australian Human Rights Commission has driven our legislation since 1992. It's a one-stop shop. Anybody can go to it. It's very accessible, very user-friendly. And the way the Human Rights Commission works, somebody calls by phone or email or fax or text, whatever, or in person, and says, I'm concerned about whatever the issue is. someone is assigned to go and meet with the service provider, talk about the claim discrimination, and find a way to resolve the matter. If it can't be resolved, it goes to court. So it's a pretty simple process, but I think you need a mechanism as clear as that in New Zealand, so that that's really a one-stop shop, so that enforcement is easily accessible to everybody. As Judy said, everybody should be able to put their hand up and make a comment about any form of discrimination. And that Human Rights Commission is a good model, but it's based on the legislation of the Disability Discrimination Act. So the government in New Zealand needs to have a legislation framework which reinforces the CRPD. And remember, CRPD, the R stands for rights. We're talking about the rights of people with disabilities. It's very important. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Catherine?
Thank you very much. So just to mention, David was talking about the importance of data, and you might not have data, but we often do very quick and dirty data presentations that are not really scientific and perfect, but demonstrate adequately how bad the situation is. And I'm happy afterwards we can email, I can share with you some examples of things that we've done. Also, we've had help with people doing that kind of thing, just to show very quickly. In terms of the standards, I think you're well aware of it, that there are now many international standards that can be used. The EU has very good accessibility standards, which have been used in other parts of the world, like India, Japan, Mexico, Australia, Canada, Kenya, like the ICT standard, the built environment design for all. But actually, really, my heart beats fast when I hear our American colleagues talking about the US Access Board. We really tried to get an EU Access Board, and we will continue to look for such a structure, because I think it would bring massive benefit in Europe, because you have all these different countries, you have the market selling products and services around, you have really need to harmonize, we have the legislation, and we would have loved if we had succeeded to have the EU commit to establish an access board. So that's something we've had David speaking at many of our events, trying to sell the massive benefits of having this kind of service and technical support. So I hope that that's something that you might be able to go for. And then finally, of course, the ability to go to court at the end of the day, or the ability to have the thing enforced is incredibly important. And you can signpost people afterwards, even if it is a bit complicated, you can signpost and help people with that. And Jared said as well, you can bypass and you can use the optional protocol. One last thing as an ingredient to the legislation, which I have to say has helped us. There's lots of gaps in the European Accessibility Act in terms of the scope in particular. But what's been very good is the functional requirements can be applied in other fields. And you'll be happy, the colleagues who helped us with the development of the Act, to hear that they were automatically applied in the European ID card without us even campaigning for. In the EU, like, not to mention the war, but the COVID Green Pass, the certificate for traveling around, not in the original proposal, but after advocacy, we managed to have the functional requirements of the Accessibility Act included there too. So if you can somehow make sure there's a provision in the legislation that will mainstream those requirements in the green transition, you will have loads of transition in New Zealand for the environment, in tourism development, in the transport sector. If you've got something that will then be nearly automatically applied in artificial intelligence, digital services in the future, if you can try and have these kind of provisions, so your accessibility legislation will then actually be borne out in future legislation affecting other sectors. I think that can be great.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. I think it's interesting you talk about how we can bring in accessibility elements into other legislation as well. Recently, I went on holiday up north in New Zealand, and I visited this kauri forest walk. So in New Zealand we have kauri trees, and they are native to New Zealand, and we're trying to protect them. So they have this wooden boardwalk which is raised to protect the kauri trees, and it's all flat and wooden and fully wheelchair accessible for me. It was for me. So it was like a win-win because it was protecting the environment, but it was also made wheelchair accessible. So there's definitely ways that can benefit lots of people, not just disabled people. Juliana, am I handing back to you for a quick summary and then we'll head on to the next topic?
Yeah, actually, we have a few questions from the public that we will address now. So, Denise, she asked, do you recommend that the UN Sustainable Development Goals be part of the conversation with the accessibility access? Is anyone that would like to talk to it? So do you recommend that the UN SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, be part of the conversation with accessibility access? How we can link those things up?
Why not?
I like it. Why not?
Yeah.
Definitely.
I think it depends on if the New Zealand government is really committed to them. So, and then it can help you build some allies if you have a minister leading on that, because it's clearly, you're right, you can really draw on the Sustainable Development Goals and the leave no one behind clause of that. I find here that the Sustainable Development Goals have become less of a political priority since COVID, and the COVID recovery investments are more of a hook. But if you've got a big commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals in New Zealand, then you can bring in new allies like this.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think the other issue is how you use them, because the language itself and the principles behind it, I think, is what is important. And when looking at the work that IDA and other groups had to do to get the SDGs to include disability in a number of the SDGs specifically, I think learning from them, what's been working, the ability to measurement, what countries are doing a good job on taking the SDGs seriously. And for this, it would mean that they also were including disability. So I think it's another tool. And if, as Catherine was saying, this is something that New Zealand is looking at across all the SDGs or a few of the SDGs that relate to what you're talking about, that also could give you allies from government who are working on this and understand its benefit and maybe don't really understand the CRPD and how these things are linked.
Thank you. Any other speakers want to comment on that? Otherwise, we have another question here. So Sean said, disability is frequently mentioned in the work of basic income advocates. What figures come to mind when you hear of basic income? How is the association likely to shape people's perceptions of basic income? Disabled workers are more likely to face discrimination and poverty traps in employment, and basic income could be a necessary component of accessibility. Anyone would like to speak to this topic? Just to give a bit of context, half of here in New Zealand, we don't talk about people talk about the pay gap. When we think of people with disabilities, we talk about the employment gap because the unemployment rate is huge.
Can I say one thing on it? Because we're working on this issue of minimum wage and minimum income is a big priority in the European Union now. And so one thing on some of our members really appreciate the basic income or the minimum income because of having uncomplicated access to enough money, to live decent standard of living. One of the caveats that we have on this is that in nearly every European country, there's no separation between income support and disability related support. And in some European countries, people with disabilities, they have to spend 23,000 euros a year extra just to live. So, and I'm sure in New Zealand, you have similar things because of inaccessibility. You have housing costs, transport costs, extra support costs that you're paying for yourself, childcare costs. You probably have all these extra costs. So if you have a minimum income or a basic income, you need to make sure that that wouldn't bring down the income of people with disabilities who are receiving specific support, assistive technology or other things, that it wouldn't, because sometimes when you receive something, then you no longer have a right to something else. So I think the disability related support, I think, always needs to be maintained. But I know that many people really appreciate the basic income because of taking away the complication. But I'm always just cautious because of the extra disability related costs.
Again, I think we need to emphasize that New Zealand is 5 million people. So some of the issues that Catherine is talking about in Europe, and when you talk about this in the United States, I just scratch my head because the discussion itself is quite complicated, not even including disability. But I think, again, you know, if this is something that's seriously being discussed in New Zealand, then points that Catherine was making, for example, are not unique to Europe, but are true in many countries where you're eligible something that could deny you something else. And so I think these are issues that can be looked at and addressed. So if this is serious discussion overall about basic income, then definitely just disabled people should be at the table on that.
Is David Lepofsky, might I jump in?
Of course, Jamie, please.
Okay, I don't have a clean answer. I'm going to give you some tactical thoughts to bear in mind. To some extent, the issues of income support and accessibility legislation are separate pieces. They obviously overlap because accessibility isn't relevant if, like, you can't eat. But also there can be accessibility barriers to getting income support. So for example, if there's an appeal process, if you're refused social assistance and that appeal process is laden with disability barriers, obviously accessibility is an important weapon you can yield. Where I am, there are kind of two coalitions. One is working on the income support disability piece, and the one that I lead is working on the accessibility piece. That's not any sort of disagreement or whatever. It's just there's only so many hours in the day. They're covering their piece, we're covering our piece, and we need both voices. However, it's also important to understand if you're thinking about how to organize people with disabilities, and that point's been made by Judy, by David, by Michael, by Catherine, by everybody. One of the things that's a practical reality is for people with disabilities who can barely get by or can't get by right now, income support is the number one issue. Talking about making our school system accessible, making our public transit system accessible, and so on, making our healthcare system accessible, while that's really important, it's also a chunk of time away, and people are concerned about what's happening, like getting to eat today and tomorrow. I don't have a quick answer other than you can't advocate for one and be unaware of the other, nor would you be. But it does, on the other hand, you can't, a New Zealand accessibility law is not going to be covering every need that a person with a disability could have, including income support. On the other hand, at the very least, it's important when you're talking to government to say, look, in advocating for this, we're not taking away from the fact that income support and a livable income is fundamental to people, so they can get to the point of benefiting from accessibility. Back to you.
This is David. Not directly on point about income support, but employment generally. So the ADA is very broad in its scope. The first part of the ADA, Title I, deals with employment. Before the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990, about 2/3 of Americans with disabilities were unemployed. Today, about 2/3 of adults with disabilities are unemployed. So, you know, even though it was a central part of the legislation, it's a really tough nut to crack. So employment, unemployment, is still a very big issue in our country, despite the fact of having legislation addressing it.
Again, if I could say, the beauty of a country of 5 million is that you theoretically can deal with things easier. When you look at issues like unemployment, we're looking at something which goes beyond accessibility. I mean, certainly accessibility and accommodations can be a big barrier to people getting employed if they need them to be successful. But I think the bigger issue is if an employer doesn't understand either what their obligations are or the benefit of. So when you're talking about 5 million people, you know, in disability, we're talking about different clusters. So those people like myself, and I presume David Lepovsky. David, did you have your disability when you were younger?
I sure did. I was born partially sighted.
Yeah.
I'm now totally blind.
So, you know, you've got, when looking at employment, the educational system that younger disabled people are going through. Is it equivalent to, is it integrated into, are students getting taught what they need to be competitive in the world of work? In a country of 5 million, I'm not saying it's easy, but it is easier. You may have national standards, you may have all types of things that in big countries like the US, we don't have. So there's complexities on these issues, but I think what we have seen, and I completely support what David Capozzi is saying, we are not yet where we need to be, but I think we've been moving, as have other countries, more things in place. Studies which are showing the benefit of disabled people under the DEI work that is being specifically done by companies to really do retraining of their staff on recruitment and the human resource areas. Strengthening of the voices of disabled people, because one thing we've seen a lot, and I'm sure this is not unique to the US, is many affinity groups that companies are setting up affinity groups that are focusing on disability, and that where that's happening in big companies like Microsoft and Google and smaller companies, you're really seeing the voices of disabled people having a much stronger impact within the organization, which is resulting in some more employment of people. So I think, you know, employment is a critical issue. Accessibility around it is critical. And it also needs a broader framework for discussion to really look at where are the barriers and who needs to be brought into this discussion and who needs to be held accountable.
Absolutely. Michael, you have your hand up for quite some time.
Yes, sure. Yeah, two comments. Firstly, back on, I think the topic was about income support. A reference that might be useful is the NDIS in Australia, which is the National Disability Insurance Scheme. It's been in effect for about 10 years. It now assists something like 400,000 people with a range of disabilities. And that started, it had political support. It's going through some dramas at the moment because of different government points of view, which is always another issue we haven't talked a lot about, how different politics can influence. You know, one side of government thinks it's a good idea, the other side automatically opposes it. So the NDIS has had a bit of a rocky road, but the principles of supporting people with a range of disabilities, I think, has been a great achievement in Australia. That's the NDIS. And the other just comment that follows on from Judy and David's comment about the importance of education and employment and so on. We've always said that access is a means and not an end. You know, I think a lot of people think that this whole thing is about creating an accessible ramp or a toilet, but access is simply a means to enable people to get to education, to get to employment, to get to recreation, to get to opportunity. So I think politically in New Zealand, it's also important to stress that point, that the access is not the end of the game. And it's interesting, when Don Mackay was chairing the CRPD in New York back in 2006, when we finally agreed to the whole thing, Don Mackay, one of his final great comments was, "This is just the beginning." It was a terrific comment, and the whole world, 150 or so countries were there. Unfortunately, not the US, and hopefully one day the US will ratify the CRPD. That'll be a great day, Judy and David. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you know, in Brazil, we have the experience when people have like a benefit and they are really scared of, you know, applying for a job, getting a job, and then losing the job, and then they lost the benefit. So there's so many things that we need to look at when facilitating and increasing the employment. We do
This is Judy, if I could just say one quick thing.
Sure.
So on issues like this again are barriers that all of our countries face. I think finally in the United States, what we are beginning to see is many more states that are raising income limits, asset limits. And so not to discuss it now, but I think this issue of working across country on particular issues is very beneficial for everybody.
Thank you, Judy. Yeah, absolutely. I will put another question from the public, and then we're gonna get into the fourth topic. So from Kay, do panelists have good examples of laws or policies for part-time or flexible work options for larger employers? Many disabled people want to work, but haven't the capacity for full-time work. In New Zealand, decent part-time work is rare. Who would like to address this question?
I can say something, Juliana, if that's so. In EDF, we published a couple of years ago. We do a human rights report series, and so we compare the performance of different countries in Europe on different elements of the convention. And the one on poverty and social exclusion gave us a lot of information about this, but I'm not talking now about companies, but certainly the country with the highest rate of employment for people with disabilities was Sweden, where there was a lot of flexibility. People were able to go back to work part-time while receiving disability-related support. So it wasn't an all or nothing situation. So this is worth looking at, I believe. And because we have the same situation more or less as David mentioned for the US, our human rights report this year will be specifically on employment. So really trying to dig into why, with all of the measures that have been taken and all the things that have been put in place, the anti-discrimination legislation, all of these things, why employment rates are not shifting. So this will be a focus for us in the coming period as well.
Yeah, there's so many layers of things that needs to be done. Like as David, no, it wasn't David, it was Michael that said that this is just the beginning. Having the accessibility legislation will be just the beginning. It doesn't mean that because you have a legislation, everybody will comply with it. And there will still be a lot of work to be done in terms of education, awareness, changing attitudes. So yeah, we have a lot of work to do. I will pass now to Olivia so she can introduce the fourth topic of our discussion today.
Great. So our fourth topic is giving effect to Indigenous people's rights in accessibility legislation. So maybe not all the panelists are able to answer this, but we'll just throw it out there anyway. So the Treaty of Waitangi, or Te Tiriti o Waitangi, is one of New Zealand's founding constitutional documents. So I'd like to hear from our panelists if your laws have given effect to First Peoples' rights. If yes, how was this achieved? But if not, what is being planned to ensure this important aspect is included in the future? I'm going to just open the floor to the panelists if someone wants to go first.
I'll have a go at that. One of the organisations we work very closely is the First Peoples Disability Network, which is obviously a network of the oldest culture on earth, 60 or 80,000 years in Australia, or Indigenous Australians. And we have workshops with them. They're a very active political group. They've got a strong lobby in Canberra and in all capital cities. And their fundamental issue there is that the government calls it closing the gap in various programs, including disability. But from the First Peoples point of view, the fundamental problem is a lack of consultation. And I think this probably applies to Indigenous communities around the world that, the power brokers make the decisions, and the Indigenous people accept the outcome, whereas there's been very strong activity in our First Peoples networks to really enforce the need for proper consultation. And I think that's really the central need in our liaison with our Indigenous people. Thank you.
Thanks,
Could you
Michael.
please repeat the question?
So we're asking about what laws have given effect to First Peoples' rights. So in New Zealand, we have the Treaty of Waitangi, which is one of our founding constitutional documents, and how we can ensure First Peoples' rights are included in the future of accessibility legislation. I think Jared has his hand up, so we'll go to you next.
You guys hear me okay? I don't have a good answer to this question. It's a very hard question, just to say that it is an area that the UN itself needs to look more at the intersection of Indigenous rights and disability rights. And certainly there are shared elements in terms of a very serious history of marginalization, societal inequity, which remains entrenched. And then also key principles around self-determination and autonomy, the need for consultation, access to justice issues, disproportionate levels of violence, institutionalization. I think the late Alice articles recently were really groundbreaking and kind of did certainly highlight the intersection of the situation of Indigenous children with disabilities and Māori children in New Zealand, and those with psychosocial disabilities as well. So I don't have a good clear answer here, just to say that hopefully that is something that can be in a way used to put to the foreign minister, because obviously it's her constituency as well, even if not formally her portfolio. And yeah, there's no good answer from the UN yet, but hopefully the International Disability Alliance, we're working hard on that issue and hoping for something in the years to come.
Thanks, Jared. Any other comments on that from our panelists?
I want to say that there's nothing on this in European accessibility legislation at all, which addresses accessibility needs of Indigenous peoples in Europe. But I do know, as Jared mentioned, I know that the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Jared Quinn, has said in some of his speeches that the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has kind of didn't address this particular issue, and I think it's something that he's going to look at. So I think it was mentioned already to reach out to the UN Special Rapporteur, Jared Quinn, on your issues in general, but this is something that I think he's particularly interested in highlight, not in relation to accessibility, but in general, how Indigenous people's rights are reflected in and included in the human rights framework.
David, I think you were going to mention something.
I think Judy is going to go first.
Oh, I was just going to say, so if you're from first country and you're not living on sovereign land, then you have the same protections under the law. And David was going to speak about ADA and what it may be mentioning in this regard.
So for the ADA, it's a little complicated. I mentioned earlier that our legislation is comprehensive. So there's 5 titles. Title 1 is employment. Title 2 deals with state and local governments. Title 3 deals with places of public accommodation, like restaurants, theaters. I'll talk about those 3 because the answer is different for each of them. And under Title 1, it is inapplicable to tribal nations, and it specifically is excluded as an employer. So if a tribal nation is an employer, they are specifically excluded under Title I of the ADA, which is also true with other civil rights laws that preceded the ADA. Under Title II, Title II is ambiguous as to whether it's covered, although the few court cases have indicated that it's not applicable. Title III is applicable, but private individuals can't sue tribal nations unless the tribe has explicitly waived their sovereign immunity. So for a restaurant or a theater on a tribal nation, that would have to be accessible. They couldn't discriminate, although enforcement gets a little tricky. So it's not a clear-cut answer. It depends, I would say. The one thing that we do have is there's an older executive order that requires federal agencies to consult and coordinate with Indian and tribal governments when they're developing regulations. So that's existed for a number of years.
Thanks, David. I'll throw it back to you, Juliana, and I think we might be taking a break soon.
Yeah, thank you so much, Olivia. I just want to make a remark here about what Michael said with Indigenous people in Australia. That's something that I think for all people with disabilities, we don't want consultation, we want co-design. You know, we want to be part of it, like full on, not being consulted every, I don't know, 3 months, you know, we need co-design. We need to be the decision makers of whatever legislation, policies, rules that affect our lives. So now let's have a very quick break, 5 minutes. Again, stretch yourself if you can, get some movement, get some blood in your brain, drink some water, and we will be back at 11:07.
Juliana, could I just finish your last comment then? The reason why the consultation was so important, one small example was we had a workshop about housing a couple of years ago, and the consultation issue was that in more remote settlements around Australia, the government is providing prefabricated housing that comes on trucks and is assembled in remote communities. The lack of consultation was that the type of house fundamentally did not work. It didn't understand the meeting place concept of a house, the indoor and outdoor use of spaces. It was a Western model house applied to a remote settlement, and the consultation process was really, to us, the first step towards co-design, that you have to have the consultation to get the design right. And that's the process that we're involved in at the moment. And one other very quick thing to you, Catherine, please give my best regards to Gerard Quinn when you see him next. We worked very closely together during the drafting of the CRPD. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.